The sum wasn't much, just enough to plant doubt and hurt my already clean name for 3 years. He said I took it, his voice cold as packing it into a coffin, but the truth lay in the western field, buried with his horse on a stormy night. The rain had stopped, but the memory of it lingered, a cold, heavy smell that clung to the eaves and seeped into the very wood of the houses. The sky was the color of old pewter, and the air was so still you could hear the distant, rhythmic creak of the windmill turning, struggling against the stillness. I stood by my kitchen window, watching the water drip, slow and deliberate, from the gutter. Tick. Drop. Tick. It was a measured silence, the kind that follows a great noise and leaves everything feeling slightly off-kilter, listening. I was trying to repair an old clock, a simple pendulum piece, but my hands kept finding the wrong gear. My mind was already halfway across town, near Jacob's small, leaning farmstead. It had been 3 days since the storm. 3 days since the telephone pole outside my house snapped like a dry twig. 3 days since midnight died. Midnight was Jacob's only constant. A great, somber-colored horse, older than most of the children in Riverwood. To Jacob, he was more than a horse, he was a silent keeper of secrets, a heavy presence that anchored Jacob to the earth. I finished wiping down the clock face, placing the clean brass pendulum back in its slot. It swung for a moment, then stopped. A tiny failure. I left the clock, unfinished, on the workbench and grabbed my coat. Jacob would need help. Not with words. Jacob had never been a man for words, but with the quiet, necessary work of the earth. The mud road leading up to Jacob's farm was the color of dark chocolate, churned and slick. Each step I took was a small, sucking sound, slurp, a protest from the earth. I didn't knock. The door to Jacob's small cottage was already ajar, a sliver of darkness framed by the yellow lamplight inside. He sat at his kitchen table, a chipped enamel mug cradled in both hands, staring. Not at anything specific, just staring at the space between the salt shaker and the sugar bowl. He was gaunt. The lines on his face had deepened since I saw him last, etched by something heavier than just age. His eyes were red-rimmed and distant, like 2 stones at the bottom of a fast-running stream. He hadn't shaved. The air was thick with the smell of stale coffee and something else, a metallic, musky scent of grief. He didn't acknowledge me. Not a nod, not a movement. His silence wasn't a rebuke, it was a wall built of exhaustion and pain. I stood there for a long moment, the water slowly seeping from my coat onto his clean wooden floor. I waited for the silence to break itself. It never did. "The ground's soft," I finally said, my voice low, almost a whisper. "Best get it done before the frost returns." Jacob shifted, a slow, agonizing movement. He looked down at his mug, tracing the chip on the rim with his thumb. "I tried," he mumbled. "Couldn't lift the shovel." I understood. The weight of the world, sometimes, settles not on your shoulders, but on your shovel. We moved to the stable. It was a miserable sight. Midnight lay in the corner, a massive, unmoving shape under a thick, dark blanket. The smell was stronger here, a deep, earthy scent of wet hay, animal, and decay. The storm had left its calling card, a shattered window pane, rainwater pooled in the stall, and straw scattered everywhere, tangled with mud. I got the tools, a heavy spade, a pickaxe, and a length of worn rope. We found a spot near the fence line, far enough from the well. Jacob stood leaning against the stable door, his eyes fixed on the covered shape of his friend. He didn't offer to help with the digging. He just watched the act of preparation, a mute spectator to his own final goodbye. While I dug, Jacob stirred. He wandered into the stable, avoiding the still form. He walked around the empty stalls, his hands running along the splintered wood, his feet kicking idly at the wet straw. It was a restless movement, an uneasy energy in the middle of his great sorrow. He wasn't grieving the animal's memory, he was searching for something. I paused, resting on the handle of the spade, watching him. He reached under a loose board in the corner, near the water trough. He fumbled there for a moment, his brow furrowed, then pulled his hand back, empty. He repeated the action under a pile of old sacking. His movements were quick, almost frantic, contrasting sharply with the desolate calm he showed me earlier. "What is it, Jacob?" I asked, my voice cutting through the damp air. He flinched, startled, as if I had caught him doing something shameful. "Nothing," he said quickly, too quickly. He wiped his hand on his trousers. "Just looking for my old smoking pipe. Haven't seen it since the storm." A smoking pipe. It felt like a thin piece of paper trying to cover a gaping hole. I nodded slowly, returning to the digging, but the scent of wet grass was now overlaid with the sharp, acrid smell of a new, unsettling doubt. We finished the burial before dusk. The plot was uneven, the mound of earth stark and temporary. The cold pewter sky had turned a sickly orange-gray. We stood there, side by side, two silent men watching the sun retreat from the day's hard work. Jacob didn't say thank you. He just stood there, his shoulders hunched, his gaze lost on the fresh earth. Then, the suddenness of it struck me. It was like a shutter snapping open in a dark room. "The money," Jacob whispered, the word thin and brittle as old ice. I turned to him. "What money, Jacob?" He finally looked at me, and his eyes were no longer distant. They were sharp, focused, and utterly devoid of trust. It was the hardest look I had ever received from him in 40 years of knowing him. "The money for Midnight's doctor," he said, his voice rising, but still held low by the surrounding silence. "My savings." It was in the small pine box, tucked behind the old feed barrel. "I checked yesterday. Before you. Before we." He couldn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. The meaning was suspended between us, heavy and unmistakable. "You think I took it, Jacob?" My own voice was measured, level. The accusation was absurd, yet I felt a cold knot forming in my stomach. "You were here," he hissed, taking a small, unsteady step toward me. "You were the only one here when I was too sick with grief to even think straight. You were digging near the stables. You knew where I kept it." The accusation landed not with the force of an explosion, but with the quiet, chilling finality of a lock clicking shut. I didn't argue. An argument would only feed the fire he was desperate to light. I simply held his gaze, letting him see nothing in mine but the quiet truth of my innocence. It didn't matter. Grief had blurred his vision. Loss had chosen a target. He pulled a damp, dirty handkerchief from his pocket and slowly, deliberately, wiped his nose. The simple action was a terrible period at the end of his charge. "Just go, Elias," he muttered, turning his back to me and walking slowly toward his dark cottage. "Just go." I stood alone by the grave, the cold air filling the space where our friendship had just been. I walked back the same sucking, mud-laden path, but the walk felt different now. Every tiny sound seemed to be whispering Jacob's accusation. "Thief! Thief!" I replayed the scene in the stable. Jacob, kicking the straw. Jacob, his hand fumbling under the loose board. His hurried, flimsy lie about the smoking pipe. It was the desperate fumbling that bothered me. A man who has just lost his life's companion should not be so immediately preoccupied with a missing pipe. He was looking for something that mattered more than a quick smoke. He was looking for the box. I stopped by the edge of my property, near a pile of old fence posts. The sun was gone now, and the blue hour was setting in, washing the world in a cold, melancholic light. I leaned against a post, trying to untangle the emotional knot from the factual one. If Jacob had lost the box, and if he believed it was in the stable, why was he so certain I took it? Why the sudden, brutal jump to accusation? I remembered his behavior just before the burial. He was insistent. He refused to move Midnight's body from the exact spot where the horse had fallen. He'd said he wanted the horse to rest exactly where he took his last breath. It seemed like a purely sentimental, grief-driven demand. But now, looking at the dark mound of earth, the memory of his urgency was sharper, colder. Jacob was always meticulous. He was the kind of man who counted his savings twice a week, who never mislaid anything of value. To suggest he simply lost the pine box, especially when he was so sure about its last location behind the barrel, felt wrong. The money, the box, the stable, and the burial. The 4 points of the compass in this small, sudden mystery. I closed my eyes. I could still smell the stable air, the wet straw, the animal, the metallic scent of death. But beneath it, there was the faintest trace of something else. Something hard to place. Like cut lumber, perhaps. Or wet pine. Why didn't Jacob look for the money box before burying the horse? The question wasn't about my innocence anymore. It was about his truth. A man in his state of grief would instinctively check his most valuable possession before committing the final act. But Jacob had been searching the empty stable stalls after the digging had begun. It was a failure of logic, not of memory. And in a man as orderly as Jacob, a failure of logic felt like a betrayal. I pushed myself off the fence post. The cold was getting deep. I started walking back toward my house, but my steps were no longer steady. They were hesitant, thoughtful. Back in my kitchen, the old clock on the workbench still lay unfinished. The pendulum was still, waiting. I sat down, pulling off my coat, and the cold, earthy smell of the mud and the stable, the scent of wet grass came with me. It clung to my skin, a silent witness to the exchange. I took the small, cold pendulum in my hand. It was beautiful brass, perfectly balanced, but useless without its motion. Jacob had accused me of a betrayal of trust. But his confusion, his panicked searching, his strange urgency about the burial. They all suggested a different story, one he wasn't ready to tell. He had buried the truth of the money's whereabouts with the horse, under that mound of cold earth. And now, a simple wooden box less than a foot square had become heavier than the spade I used to dig the grave. I looked out the window again. The darkness was complete. The silence was absolute. The truth was somewhere out there, waiting for me to find the right tool to dig it up. Tomorrow, I decided, I would not be going to the stable to look for a smoking pipe. I would be going to look at the floor. The scratches, I thought. I needed to see the scratches on the floor of the stable, where Midnight lay. The next evening arrived with the kind of stillness that presses down on the eardrums. A heavy, woolen blanket of air. I had tried to work. I had tried to mend the clock again, but my hands were clumsy. The brass gear slipped and clattered onto the wooden bench, a sharp, alien sound in the quiet house. I left it there. My thoughts kept pulling me back to Jacob's farm, to the accusation he had laid like a cold stone at my feet. The accusation wasn't the main problem. The main problem was the lie. Or the truth he was hiding. I took the oil lantern from the porch. The glass was smeared with old soot. I wiped it clean with the sleeve of my coat. The simple act of preparation felt important, methodical. I wasn't going to steal back a good name, I was going to find the missing piece of a pattern. The light from the lantern was a small, unsteady globe of yellow in the encroaching blue-black of the night. It barely illuminated the path ahead, forcing me to walk slowly, deliberately, placing each foot carefully on the uneven ground. The path was frozen now, the mud from yesterday hardened into sharp, rutted ridges. I reached the farm. Jacob's cottage was dark. A thin, single wisp of smoke curled lazily from the chimney, the only sign of life. He was inside, alone, breathing the same air as his resentment. The latch on the stable door was cold and slick under my glove. It groaned in protest when I lifted it, a low, mournful sound that seemed to carry across the desolate fields. I paused inside the doorway. The air was different here tonight. Heavier. The scent of wet hay and manure was less overwhelming now, replaced by the dry, lingering smell of the storm's damage, dust, rotting wood, and something faintly metallic. My lantern cast long, dancing shadows, turning the familiar stable into a distorted, alien landscape. The empty stalls looked like vacant prison cells. The space where Midnight had rested was the darkest part of the room. I didn't light the whole space. I held the lantern low, letting the light be drawn to the floor. The floorboards were old, pitted, and worn smooth by years of hooves and straw. They remembered every movement. I wasn't looking for money. Money is loud and obvious. I was looking for a whisper, a contradiction in Jacob's memory. I moved slowly, step by step, my boots crunching softly on the dry, residual hay. The lantern swung gently, the light strobing across the walls, revealing spiderwebs woven thick with dust and the dark, intricate patterns of water damage. I remembered the day we buried Midnight. I remembered the chaos. The stable was a mess of debris, broken roof tiles, shattered pieces of bucket, and the wet, tangled straw. Jacob had been too overcome to see the details. He only saw his loss. A detail suddenly presented itself. A shard of broken ceramic lay near the feed trough. It was a piece of the chipped enamel mug Jacob had been holding yesterday. He must have broken it after I left, or maybe even before, when he realized the box was gone. His distress wasn't an act. The pain was real. But the source of the pain, I suspected, was not just the theft. I knelt down in the mud and hay near the corner where the body had been. The ground was still slightly softer here, despite the cold. It was here that Jacob had been searching, fumbling under the loose board, claiming he was looking for his pipe. I reached out and felt the cold, gritty floor. My fingertips found the groove beneath the board. Empty. His lie felt too fragile for such a large accusation. If he had planned to blame me, he would have made his lie stronger. The weakness of his cover story, the missing pipe, was the strongest evidence that he was hiding something from himself, not from me. He was hiding the truth of the box's last location. I stood up, moving away from the burial site towards the center of the stall. This was the area where Midnight spent most of his time, where the wood would be most worn. I held the lantern steady, peering at the floorboards, looking for anything that seemed out of place in the ancient, familiar grain of the wood. The heavy silence of the stable pressed in, making every intake of breath sound unnaturally loud. It took time. It took the patient, deliberate focus of a man used to working with tiny, intricate clock gears. My eyes adjusted to the narrow cone of light. I moved the lantern slowly, millimeter by millimeter, scanning the planks. Then I saw it. It was not immediately obvious. It was not a gash or a hole. It was a mark. Near the back wall, maybe 4 feet from where Midnight's head would have rested, I saw a subtle deviation in the wood grain. It looked like a long, thin scar, maybe 15 inches in length. It ran perpendicular to the main direction of the planks. I crouched down, holding the lantern closer. The heat of the lamp warmed the dust on the floor. It was a deep scratch. Not the surface abrasion of a hoof, or the wear of a dropped tool. It was precise. It began faintly, then dug in deeper and deeper, then trailed off suddenly. The wood fibers were splintered at the edges, slightly darker, as if the injury had been old and dried before the storm filled it with water. I traced the line with my finger. It was sharp, a distinct valley carved into the thick wood. The texture felt wrong. It felt like something heavy had been dragged over the floor, something with a jagged, low-lying edge. I didn't immediately think of the money box. My mind went straight to the horse. Where Midnight usually stood, the floor would be worn smooth. But this scratch was behind the usual standing spot, near the wall. If Midnight had been tied, this would be the direction of his greatest tension. I remembered Jacob's insistence on burying the horse immediately, not moving the body. If the scratch was caused by the edge of the money box, then the box must have been dragged. If it was dragged, it must have been tied to something. And the most likely thing for it to be tied to was Midnight himself. I stood up slowly, the lantern trembling slightly in my hand. The idea was chilling in its simplicity. Jacob hadn't lost the box, he had secured it. The silence of the stable now felt vast, full of unasked questions. Was this scratch the trail the box left as Midnight struggled and fell? The discovery of the scratch didn't bring immediate clarity, it brought a new kind of discomfort. A cold certainty that my friend Jacob was lying, not about me, but about the events leading up to the horse's death. I walked over to the nearest stall door and leaned my forehead against the rough wood. The cold shock was a momentary anchor. I tried to put myself in Jacob's shoes before the storm. Midnight was failing. Jacob was worried about the vet's bill, worried about the loss of his savings. He didn't trust the bank. He didn't trust anyone but his horse. He secured the box to the horse. The thought was almost impossible to comprehend. It was an act of desperation so profound it twisted the familiar world. He must have believed the horse would survive, and the box, tied low to the saddle or harness, would be safe and secure with the animal until the morning. A desperate man's logic. But then the storm hit. And Midnight collapsed. If the horse fell with the box still tied to him, and if the box was underneath the weight of the animal, Jacob wouldn't have been able to retrieve it. He would have been too weak, too grief-stricken, and perhaps too frantic to move the enormous body in the middle of a deluge. He would have known, or at least suspected, exactly where the box was. And that brought me back to the accusation. Why blame me? Because the money was already gone to him. Gone, not by theft, but by the devastating, final weight of his own horse. He couldn't face the truth that his beloved friend, in his final moments, had taken the last of his savings with him. Blaming Elias, blaming an external, cruel force was easier than accepting that crushing, internal reality. It was a way to redirect his own terrible mistake. I looked at the scratch again. It wasn't a random mark. It told a story of extreme tension, of something solid being dragged by something desperate. The faintness of the mark suggested it happened quickly, just before the final, heavy fall. I ran my hand across the rough grain of the wood, feeling the cold air rise from the deep cut. It felt like an old wound. I knew, suddenly, that the box wasn't simply buried. It was still attached to something buried. I moved the lantern and scanned the rest of the stable floor, the corners, the walls, the places where a panicked man might have stashed something. Nothing. Just damp straw and silent wood. Jacob wasn't looking for the box when I saw him searching. He was looking for proof that his horrific thought that the box was still with Midnight was wrong. And when he didn't find the box, the accusation against me became the easier answer. The softer truth. I left the stable door ajar, letting the darkness swallow the yellow light of the lantern. The stillness of the night returned. The scent of wet grass from the burial site seemed to follow me back, but now it carried a new dimension, the bitter, quiet tang of Jacob's despair. I walked a few paces and stopped, looking back at the dark, silent shape of the stable. It was a solid, unmoving structure, but inside, I knew, a great, terrible emotional weight had just been shifted. I gripped the lantern handle. It was warm from the flame. The light was faint, but it was enough. I had found the contradiction in the floor, a scratch that was deeper than any word Jacob had spoken. It led away from the place where the horse's head had been, toward the cold mound of earth. I hadn't found the money. But I had found the path of its disappearance. The scratch proved the box went into the ground. But the box was still small. A man couldn't tie a small box to a horse without a harness, a tether, or something more substantial. I closed my eyes and whispered the final question into the cold, empty night. What was holding the box to the horse? Tomorrow, I needed to talk to Silas. Silas, who helped dig the hole, and who may have seen what Jacob was so desperate to hide. The next chapter would be in the silence of another man. The day dawned with a low, gray ceiling that seemed to press all sound down into the damp earth. The cold had lifted slightly, replaced by a light, persistent drizzle, the kind of rain that doesn't soak you immediately but seeps into your bones slowly, meticulously. I packed the lantern away, its soot-stained glass now holding the ghost of last night's discovery. The memory of the scratch on Jacob's stable floor was sharper than the cold outside, a cut on the polished surface of what I thought I knew about my neighbor. The scratch proved that something was dragged. Something attached. The question was no longer if Jacob was hiding something, but why he had hidden it so deliberately within the final act of grieving. I needed an anchor. Someone who had been there, but was not blinded by grief or rage. I needed Silas. Silas lived 2 miles past Jacob's farm, in a small, weathered shack that looked like it was slowly returning to the earth it stood on. He was a man of routines, a man who worked with wood and silence, much like me with brass and time. He was also Jacob's only real confidant, though their friendship was built on shared work and unspoken understandings, not words. I took the long route, avoiding Jacob's place. The rhythm of my boots on the muddy track was the only sound, a slow, measured cadence against the silence of the countryside. I found Silas where I expected him to be, by the west perimeter, repairing the section of the fence that had been damaged in the storm. He was wearing a heavy, waxed canvas coat, the rain beating on the shoulders. He was working a piece of wire, his hands thick and gnarled, moving with the slow, unquestioning efficiency of old age. The small, focused snip of his wire cutters was the only punctuation mark in the drizzle. He didn't look up when I approached. Not immediately. He waited until I was close enough that the rain dripping from my hat would mingle with the water falling from his eaves. He finished securing the wire to the post, giving it a final, testing pull. Then, he straightened, a slow, painful unfolding of an old man's spine. His face was a roadmap of fine wrinkles, his eyes the pale, washed-out blue of old denim. He looked at me, not with curiosity, but with a deep, quiet recognition of shared burden. "Elias," he said, the word barely audible above the whisper of the rain. It wasn't a greeting, it was an acknowledgement of my presence in his misery. "Bad business." "The money," I replied, choosing to cut straight to the hard, cold fact. "Jacob thinks I took it." Silas didn't flinch. He just watched the rain for a long moment, watching the way it collected on the top strand of the wire and rolled into a thick, slow drop. "He's grieving," Silas said finally. His voice was husky, like sandpaper. Grief makes a man point his finger at the nearest shadow. "It's not grief, Silas. It's confusion." He was looking for the box after midnight was dead, after the storm. Why didn't he check for it the moment he found the horse? It was his last saving. Silas took a worn leather glove off his right hand. He rubbed his cheek with the back of his hand, a rough, rasping sound. His eyes darted away, to the muddy ground, then back to the fence post. He avoided my eyes. That avoidance told me more than a denial ever could. "You were there when they dug the hole," I pressed, keeping my voice low, flat. "You helped him." Was Jacob acting strangely? Silas picked up a small piece of shattered pine and tossed it away with a flick of his wrist. He was buying time, carefully sorting through his memory, separating the truth from the fog of the event. "He was distraught," Silas said. "More than I've ever seen him. He wanted it done now. Said he couldn't stand the sight of him lying there. Said the earth was the only cure." That's understandable. But did he say anything else? Anything about the box? About moving the horse? Silas leaned his weight against the fence, a man seeking support from something solid. The rain continued its steady, quiet work. He sighed, a long, weary exhalation of breath that seemed to carry the cold of the day. He didn't want the body touched, Elias, Silas confessed, his voice dropping to a near whisper. He was frantic about it. Don't move him, Silas. Not a single inch. Not until the pit is ready. The finality of the request was too much for simple sentiment. A flicker of understanding crossed my mind, a terrifying visualization of the moment. Why did Jacob insist the horse lie still in the exact position it had died? I stepped closer to Silas. The space between us was now reduced to the distance of a secret. He said not to move him, I repeated, tasting the words. Not that he was too heavy, or too much. But, not to move him. As if moving the body would reveal something. Silas nodded once, a quick, jerky motion, still unable to meet my gaze. The avoidance was his silent agreement. I thought it was the sickness talking, Silas murmured. Or the shock. Jacob is particular. But it was more than that. He was agitated. He was sweating, even in the cold rain. Silas put his glove back on, slowly, meticulously smoothing the leather over his fingers. He was preparing to handle something difficult, even if it was just a memory. We had to dig the pit larger than necessary, Silas recounted, his voice now taking on the steady, reflective rhythm of a man recalling a hard, technical task. Because of how he lay. Jacob kept pacing the edge of the pit, watching the shovel. Not watching the work, but watching the ground around the horse. This was the key. Jacob's focus wasn't on the dignity of the burial, it was on the protection of the secret. When we finally lowered him. Before we pushed the body in, Silas continued, his gaze drifting back to the muddy ground between us, I saw something. Just a flash. Under the saddle area. My heart gave a quiet, heavy thud against my ribs. I waited. I didn't push him. I let the silence draw the rest of the truth out. There was rope, Silas finally admitted. Wrapped around the girth, near the underbelly. It was tight. Jacob immediately threw the blanket back over him and rushed us. Said it was indecent. But it was just a flash, Elias. A dirty, thick piece of rope, tied hard. Rope. Not a casual lead line. Something that secured a weight. Something that explained the scratch on the stable floor. I closed my eyes, piecing the visual together, midnight, thrashing in the stall during the storm. The money box, tied beneath the girth, scraping against the wood as the horse tried to stand. The final collapse, the heavy body falling directly onto the secured box, pinning it. Jacob finding him, realizing his mistake, and then, in his panic, insisting the body not be moved. He didn't want the horse to lie still out of respect. He wanted the horse to lie still so the weight of the enormous body would keep the box hidden beneath it until the earth could finish the job. The rain felt colder now. The wind had picked up slightly, rustling the remaining leaves on the barren trees. The box was attached, I whispered, not to Silas, but to the cold air. He tied it to midnight to keep it safe from the storm, and when the horse fell, the box was pinned underneath. That's why he couldn't find it. That's why he was searching the empty stall. Silas didn't challenge the hypothesis. He just nodded slowly, looking older, heavier. He was panicking, Elias. And when he saw the rope, he knew it was still there. He didn't want to move midnight, even for the money. Not after what he did. It was a choice between revealing his desperate folly and losing the money. And blaming me was the release valve. It was easier than blaming the dead horse, or blaming himself, Silas said, looking directly at me for the first time. His eyes held no judgment, only a vast, tired understanding of human weakness. Jacob chose the softer lie. I looked at Silas's gnarled hands, the hands that had just secured the fence wire, the hands that had helped put an end to Jacob's last hope. Did you see what the rope was tied to? I asked. It must have been something else. Something connected to the bridle or the saddle. Silas shook his head. Just the rope on the girth. But when Jacob threw the blanket back, I saw the bridle was twisted. Like it had been tugged hard. And the saddle pad was completely torn away from one side. Torn away. A struggle. Not just the horse dying, but a final, desperate tug of war between the money box, the ground, and the falling animal. The scratch on the floor, the strange rope, and the torn saddle pad. The pieces clicked into place with the quiet finality of a lock closing. I knew exactly what I needed to find now. Not the box itself, but the proof that the box had been secured to the horse. A piece of the broken harness. The last tether. "Thank you, Silas," I said. It felt inadequate, too small for the weight of the secret he had just shared. Silas merely nodded. He bent down slowly, picking up his wire cutters, returning to the small, meticulous task of repair. "You're a good man, Elias," he muttered, not looking up. "Don't let his grief turn you sour." I left Silas standing by the fence line, a lonely silhouette working under the persistent, gray rain. The sound of his tools snip, snip faded quickly behind me. The journey back was different. The path was still cold, still wet, but the doubt that had been clouding my mind had lifted. It was replaced by a cold, clear resolve. The situation was no longer a mystery of theft, it was a tragedy of fear. Jacob's fear of losing his money had caused him to tie his future to a dying friend. His fear of admitting that mistake had caused him to tie his despair to an innocent one. I reached the western edge of Jacob's property again, the edge where midnight lay. The mound of earth looked heavier, more final than before. The rain was washing the last of the softness from the soil. The truth lay under that earth. I had the witness's whisper. I had the floor's testimony. Now I needed the metal, the hard, undeniable evidence of what had held the money to the horse. Tomorrow, I would return to the burial site. Not to mourn, and not to accuse. But to look for the last piece of the saddle, the piece that had broken away in midnight's final, desperate struggle. The ground was soft, but what lay beneath it would be hard. The night was the coldest one yet. A sharp, crystalline cold that seemed to freeze the sound before it could travel. It was past midnight, that time when the world holds its breath, and every house in Riverwood is a dark, heavy silence. I stood in my own shed, the air thick with the smell of oil and old leather. I was holding a shovel. It felt wrong, heavy, and purposeful. I was a man of fine movements, a watchmaker, not a man of earth and brute force. But the truth I was looking for was buried deep, and required a different tool. I felt a profound, aching sense of wrongness. It wasn't about the money anymore. It was about Jacob's sorrow, a sorrow so great he had chosen to defile our history by laying a false blame. I was going to dig up a physical piece of his emotional ruin. I knew the risk. If I were caught, the accusation of theft would be replaced by the certainty of desecration. But the quiet certainty from Silas, the silent testimony of the scratch on the stable floor, had given me a different kind of purpose. I wasn't digging for money. I was digging for my name, and for the possibility of retrieving Jacob's mind from its self-imposed darkness. I left the shovel in the shadow of the shed and slipped out into the darkness. The moon was thin and high, a sliver of cold, white light barely strong enough to cast shadows. It illuminated the fields in a stark, black and white clarity. Every silhouette, a tree, a fence post, a leaning barn looked like a memory carved in stone. I moved slowly, keeping to the deeper shadows along the hedges. The ground crunched beneath my thin leather shoes. The frost had returned, hardening the mud into sharp, brittle shards. Crunch. Crunch. The sound felt amplified, a loud confession in the universal silence. I reached the west perimeter of Jacob's farm. The silence here was different from the silence in town. It was heavier, deeper, marked by the recent absence of a great, breathing animal. I found the fence line, then the large, uneven mound of earth. The grave. It was stark against the frost-rimmed field. A dark, temporary scar. The sight of it brought back the raw, simple grief of that day, but now tainted by the knowledge of what lay beneath it. The money. Jacob's cruel secret. I set the shovel down carefully on the frozen grass. I took a deep, slow breath of the cold air, letting the weight of the moment settle. The guilt was heavy, but the alternative living under a lie was heavier. The silence was the only witness. I started at the edge of the mound, where the displaced earth had spilled onto the surrounding ground. I wasn't digging into the center, not yet. I was tracing the circumference of the burial, looking for the telltale signs of the horse's shape. Silas said Jacob insisted the body remain untouched. That meant the horse lay flat, and the box, pinned beneath the saddle or girth, would be at the lowest point of the slump, slightly off-center from the main weight. I used the shovel not as a digging tool, but as a probe, pushing the tip gently into the freshly turned earth. The soil was cold, yielding, but already tightening into a thick, unpleasant clay. The cold soaked through the leather of my gloves. My fingers quickly grew numb, making the delicate work of sensing the ground a coarse effort. I recalled the scratch on the stable floor. It had trailed away from the stable wall, towards the center of the stall. The metal object, the box, would have been dragged back slightly as midnight collapsed, pulling against the tether. That meant the object would be located close to the horse's flank, perhaps 18 inches to 2 feet below the surface. I paused, leaning on the shovel handle. My breathing was clouding the air in small, white bursts. I felt the profound sense of trespass, of violating a sacred, final space. But Jacob had already violated it with his deceit. I started a shallow trench, working slowly, peeling back the layers of cold, damp soil. The earth smelled rich and loamy, the honest smell of the countryside, untainted by the deception. The light from the moon was too faint to see the color of the soil, only its texture. I worked by feel, by instinct, listening for the change in sound as the shovel met resistance. Minutes stretched. The work was physically taxing, heavy and repetitive, a complete opposite of the delicate balance of clockwork. It was a meditation on brute force. The shovel blade scraped against something hard. It wasn't the soft resistance of a root, or the heavy resistance of rock. It was a sharp, distinct clink, the sound of steel meeting metal. I froze. My heart hammered, a loud, panicked rhythm in the quiet field. I set the shovel aside and dropped to my knees, feeling the cold, wet clay with my bare hands. I pushed the heavy soil away, working carefully, deliberately, afraid to move too quickly and disturb the fragile piece of evidence. The mud clung to my fingers, slick and cold. The depth was shallow, about a foot down, just as I had estimated. Too shallow for a misplaced tool. Too precise for a random piece of field debris. My fingers brushed against a small, hard object. It was cold, heavy, and strangely shaped. Not the large, flat plane of the pine box itself, but something smaller, denser. I worked the clay away until I could grasp the object fully. It was metal. Rusted, coated thick with dark earth, but undeniably metal. I pulled it free, a quick, forceful yank. I stood up, holding the artifact close to the faint moonlight. I scraped the thickest layers of clay off with my thumbnail. It was an old, heavy saddle buckle. Not a simple buckle. It was part of a large harness assembly, the kind of heavy, worn brass and steel fitting used to secure a girth or a flank strap. The leather strap was still attached to the buckle, or rather, the broken, frayed remnants of it were. The leather itself was wet and rotten from the storm and the earth, but the point of failure was the metal. The steel tongue of the buckle was bent backward, wrenched violently out of its position, and the heavy brass frame was twisted. This piece hadn't simply fallen off. It had been ripped away, torn loose from the main harness assembly under extreme, sudden force. It was too small to be the money box. But it was the smoking gun. It was the crucial link between the saddle, the rope Silas saw, and the truth Jacob buried. Was this buckle torn off in a struggle, a desperate final movement that left the box pinned below the dying horse? The discovery didn't bring relief. It brought a terrible, crushing sadness. I held the cold, twisted piece of metal in my hand. It was proof of a violent, final moment, not the quiet, dignified passing Jacob wanted to believe, but a desperate, thrashing struggle against the tether that held the money box fast. Midnight hadn't died in peace. He had died in panic, struggling against the very thing Jacob had used to protect his future. The truth was now heavier than the soil I had just moved. I examined the buckle again, turning it over and over under the weak moonlight. The metal was old, but the tear, the bending and twisting was recent. It was the damage of the final collapse, the heavy, falling weight of the horse against the taut rope, against the small, hard box. The scratch on the stable floor was explained by the box being dragged. The rope Silas saw was explained by the need to secure the box. The torn buckle was the ultimate evidence that the money box, or its tether, was secured to the horse's underside and violently ripped from the harness when the body hit the floor. Jacob must have seen the damage. He must have seen the rope still attached to the horse, or the torn harness. He must have known, in that dark, frantic moment, that the box was beneath his friend. And he chose to bury the evidence, to bury the truth, rather than face the terrible irony of his own mistake. I looked at the mound of earth again. I could dig further. I could find the pine box. But the box was merely the container. This buckle was the confession. I felt a sudden, profound understanding of Jacob's despair. He wasn't just grieving the horse and the money, he was grieving his own devastating failure of judgment. His accusation against me was a desperate, psychological attempt to externalize the betrayal he had committed against himself and his beloved animal. I carefully covered the small hole with the loose soil, patting the earth down, trying to leave no trace of my midnight visit. The act was a quiet apology to the earth, an acknowledgement that I had found what I needed and would not desecrate the grave further. The horse could rest. I walked away from the grave, the shovel tucked under my arm, the broken buckle clasped tightly in my gloved hand. The cold metal pressed against my palm, a tiny, hard fact in a world full of soft, complicated emotions. The moonlight was fading, giving way to the first, faint, metallic gray of dawn on the eastern horizon. The town was still silent, still asleep, unaware of the small tragedy I had just uncovered. I carried the shovel back to my shed, the buckle a new, unwelcome resident in my pocket. The crunch of the frost under my feet was lighter now. I was no longer an accused thief, but a silent witness. I had the evidence. The question of theft was answered. But the question of friendship remained, heavier than any shovel. I went into my kitchen, placing the buckle gently on the workbench next to the unfinished clock. The metal was cold, worn, and twisted. A testament to a final, desperate struggle. I had to confront Jacob. Not with rage, but with the quiet, undeniable weight of this small, broken object. How do you show a friend the piece of earth he buried, and help him live with the truth it holds? The next day would be a reckoning built on silence and a single piece of steel. The morning after my midnight dig was pale and quiet. The sun was trying to break through the persistent gray clouds, casting a weak, hesitant light. It was the kind of morning that demands honesty. I sat at my workbench, the broken saddle buckle lying next to the unfinished clock. The brass frame was twisted, the steel tongue bent, a small, violent testament to a final struggle. It was cold to the touch. I cleaned the last of the mud from it with a soft cloth. It wasn't just metal anymore. It was the weight of Jacob's secret, a piece of hard, undeniable fact I had to deliver to a man who preferred a soft, defensive lie. I didn't carry the anger I felt when he first accused me. It had been replaced by a deep, weary pity. Jacob hadn't been cruel, he had been utterly broken, and he had used me as a bandage for a wound only the earth could feel. I placed the buckle carefully in the pocket of my coat. I didn't need a shovel today. I needed only the weight of the truth. The walk to Jacob's farm was short. The path was still frozen, the air sharp and clean. I didn't rush. The confrontation ahead couldn't be hurried. It needed to unfold with the slow, deliberate rhythm of a long-delayed truth. Jacob was standing in the doorway of his stable, a broom in his hand. He was sweeping the wet straw from the floor, his movements slow, meticulous. He hadn't shaved. The dark stubble on his chin made his face look drawn, shadowed. He saw me approach. His broom paused mid-sweep, hovering over a pile of mud. His body stiffened, a silent, immediate tension. He didn't look away this time. His eyes were dull, expecting the rebuke, bracing for the thunder he thought I carried. I stopped a few feet from him, standing on the perimeter of the stable's darkness. "Morning, Jacob," I said. My voice was low, flat. It carried no judgment, only a quiet, steady resolve. He didn't return the greeting. He just looked at me, then at the pocket of my coat, as if he could already feel the hard, cold shape of what I carried. He was waiting for the attack. I looked past him, at the stable floor. I could see the place where the scratch was, even from the doorway. It was a faint, almost invisible mark to the untrained eye, but now I knew its meaning. It seemed to glow with a terrible significance. I stepped into the stable. I didn't raise my voice. I spoke to the air, to the shadows, to the wood. "The money wasn't stolen, Jacob," I said. "It wasn't me. It wasn't anyone." He didn't move. The broom handle was gripped tightly in his hands. "You came to accuse me back," he muttered, his voice hoarse, thick with a defensive weariness. "Just say it, Elias. Get it over with." "I came to understand," I corrected softly. "I came to understand the scratch on the floor." Jacob's eyes flickered, just for a second, a tiny, involuntary twitch of recognition. He knew what I was talking about. He knew I had looked. "There's nothing to understand," he said, turning away and making a few quick, unnecessary sweeps with the broom. "Just old wood. Things get dragged. The floor's old. It's a very specific scratch, Jacob," I continued, my voice still level. "It's the mark of a wooden box being dragged by a rope, being pulled taut against the ground right before a heavy weight fell." I reached into my pocket, slowly, deliberately. I pulled out the broken saddle buckle. The cold metal looked dull in the stable's dim light. I held it in the palm of my hand, offering it to him. Not throwing it. Just holding it out. "This came from the ground yesterday," I told him. "From beside Midnight's burial spot. It was ripped off the harness. The leather is still attached, Jacob. Ripped clean through." His eyes dropped immediately to the buckle. His face, already pale, seemed to lose the last vestige of color. He didn't reach for it. He didn't have to touch it to feel its weight. Jacob's breathing hitched. It was a small, ragged sound, the first sign of a crack in his carefully built wall of resentment. The broom slipped from his grasp, falling to the floor with a quiet, dead thud. The noise was surprisingly loud. It marked the moment of surrender. I stepped closer, still holding the buckle. "You saw the rope, Jacob." Silas saw it. Tied to the girth, under the saddle. "You tied the box there, didn't you? To keep it safe from the storm. To keep it safe for Midnight's medicine." I didn't phrase it as a question. I phrased it as a statement of fact, a quiet recount of a terrible sequence of events. Jacob pressed his hands against his eyes. His shoulders started to shake. The sound he made was not a loud cry, but a series of broken, choked-off noises, the sound of a man trying to swallow an impossible grief. He was so sick, Jacob finally whispered, the words trembling. He was shaking. I thought. If I took the box out, the storm would take it. I thought. If I tied it to him, he would keep it safe. He always kept me safe. His hands dropped away from his face. His eyes were swimming, the tears thick and slow, carving clean tracks through the grime on his cheeks. I tried to get it, he confessed, the words rushing out now, a desperate, low-pitched torrent. When he fell. When the roof came down. I tried to move him. But he was too heavy. And the rope. The rope was taut. It was stuck. He looked at the buckle in my hand, his eyes filled with self-loathing. I tore the harness. Trying to pull him. Trying to save the money. I couldn't move the horse. I broke the strap. And the box was pinned underneath. I knew it. I knew it was still there when I covered him up. The sight of his tears was not triumphant. It was profoundly painful. He wasn't crying because he was caught. He was crying because he had finally said the awful truth aloud. I stepped forward and gently placed the broken buckle into Jacob's open, trembling palm. His fingers curled around the cold metal instantly, clutching it like a drowning man grasping a small, cold stone. You chose to bury the evidence, Jacob, I said, my voice barely audible. You chose to live with the secret of your mistake, rather than the truth of the loss. And you chose my name to carry the burden. He didn't defend himself. He just stood there, the tears flowing freely now, his breath ragged. I'm sorry, Elias, he choked out. I didn't know what to do. The money. The horse. It was all gone. And I broke the harness. I broke him. I broke everything. His gaze was fixed on the buckle. He saw not a piece of harness, but the terrible conclusion of his desperation. I didn't seek an apology for the accusation. It felt irrelevant now. The greater sorrow was the rupture of his own spirit. We can dig it up, Jacob, I offered quietly. We can get the box back. It's just money. Jacob shook his head slowly, a terrible, resolute movement. No. No, Elias. Let him keep it. Let him keep the money. I tried to use him for it, in the end. He can keep it. It's buried with him now. It should stay there. His refusal was the true turning point. He wasn't choosing money, he was choosing acceptance of the loss, and perhaps, a final act of respect for his horse. I knew then that the money box wasn't the treasure, the confession was. I looked at the deep lines on Jacob's face, no longer etched by resentment, but by pure, exposed pain. He had broken, and in breaking, he had finally allowed a sliver of light into the dark room of his grief. I accept your truth, Jacob, I told him. And I forgive your accusation. We were friends before this. I hope we can be friends again. He didn't answer immediately. He stared at the buckle, then up at me, his eyes full of a raw, fragile gratitude that was more exhausting than any anger. I turned and walked to the doorway. The sun had finally broken through the clouds, a pale, watery light slanting into the stable, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air above the empty stalls. I didn't ask him to apologize again. The broken buckle in his hand was apology enough. I left him standing there, the light catching the sheen of his tears and the worn brass of the buckle. He was alone, but he was no longer carrying a secret that was heavier than the earth itself. He was holding a piece of his own broken heart. I walked back down the path, the frozen ground crunching softly under my feet. My name was clean. The clock on my workbench was still unfinished, but the balance of my world had been restored. The air was sharp. The fields were silent. The truth was known. I paused at the edge of his property, looking back at the dark, silent stable. Jacob was still standing there, the weight of the heavy truth now finally settled, allowing him the first, quiet moment of genuine grief. A broken friendship can mend, but the earth never forgets what it is asked to hold. I knew our trust would take time to rebuild, but the silence between us was no longer poisoned.